Hello and welcome to New Wave History. And I'm delighted that Professor Audrey Truschke, who's a professor of history at Rutgers University, has given us time to talk about her book. And this is a magisterial review of 5,000 years of the history of subcontinent or India, which was recently published. And we are going to talk a bit about this book, but also the connected and surrounding themes on Indian history. Welcome, Professor Truschke, and I'm so delighted that one has. I'm finally getting a chance to talk to you in detail about your very important work, because other than your scholarship, which of course has been widely acclaimed, you have also been a headline in the news media for your unrelenting and clear effort to stick to facts and the process of historiography, which of course has irked a few, but has pleased many readers and students and scholars across the world, not just in India or Pakistan or the subcontinent, but across the world. So tell us, what made you choose this topic? I mean, it's a big endeavor, looking at thousands of years and synthesizing them into a volume. What was the motivation? What inspired you to do that?
So thank you so much for having me. It's really my pleasure to be here and be chatting today. So from my perspective, I didn't choose the topic. The topic chose me, or other people chose me for the topic. I essentially wrote the book because Princeton University Press asked me to. In my mild defense, I said no first. I then later went back and said yes. And I said no because it's a patently insane idea. How can you cover the history of a quarter of the world's population, right? Like that's like all of Africa and Europe combined over 5,000 years in a single volume, right? It's a project that's doomed to be deeply flawed, to put it very mildly. But at the end of the day, I decided to write it. Obviously, I was persuaded. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but probably the most obvious one is that we need something to teach, and we need a book for people to have an entryway into South Asian history.
Right.
I wish we didn't, because I wish that everybody in the West thought about Indian history and South Asian history, and that people were not actually thinking in those broad terms, that people were thinking about North India and South India and East and West and specific time periods. But that's just simply not where we're at. We need something that gives people an overview. I do say in the book, and I mean it, that I hope it's not the last book anyone reads about the South Asian past.
Certainly. And that indeed was an ambitious undertaking, but you've done a great job. And the reviews suggest that. I was looking at them this morning. Contrary to a lot of social media noise, a lot of serious reviews of scholars are sort of acknowledging how much work you've put into that. But let me go to my other question that I wanted to ask you, was that you define the subcontinent as historically known as India, which includes today's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and parts of Afghanistan. How did you negotiate the geographic, cultural, and political span? Because, as you know, even the term South Asian or South Asia that you just used and we use very widely is also a contested one. So, this geographical terrain, how did you settle for that, or where did you draw the boundaries, of both geography and history?
Yeah, I think everything is contested, right, in South Asian history, including calling it South Asian. And of course, I call it Indian. And I mean, I titled the book India. I refer to both Indian and South Asian history throughout. Those are not identical terms. They don't mean exactly the same thing. But I am crystal clear that in the vast majority of the book, right up until 1947, India means the subcontinent. It does not mean the republic. And this is a point that I think it can be hard for modern people to sort of wrap our heads around, because we're used to the world that we live in which India, of course, means the modern nation state. But that is it's a very new formation from a historian's perspective. right? When we're thinking about 5,000 years, 75, 80 years is like nothing. That's like, yesterday. But also India geographically, in terms of the modern republic, it's much more restricted, right? It's a much more modest kind of geographical expression. The Indian subcontinent is far broader. In terms of where exactly the lines are drawn, I think the geographical features that make India a subcontinent are pretty easy, right? Like where the waters start, the subcontinent ends. But of course, you look to the north and a little bit to the east and the west, and it gets a little bit fuzzy, right?
Right.
So I'll give one example. The Indus River, right? Indus, India, same etymological root
Yeah.
there. The Indus River has long been used by many cultures and civilizations inside and outside the subcontinent as a sort of boundary point. After you
Right.
cross the Indus, you're in a different place, whether you call that Hindustan or India or Bharata or anything else. However, I include in the Indian subcontinent at times places that are significantly north of that, all the way into modern parts of what's now Afghanistan, right?
Right.
I think that it's important to have some sense of what we're talking about. But when you're speaking across thousands of years, one also doesn't want to restrict oneself unnecessarily. The bottom line is that the exact boundaries of the Indian subcontinent shifted over time, across cultures, and depending on one's point of view.
Right, right. That explains quite a bit. But let's go to some of the. I was reading your book, and it was very interesting that you note in your introduction that much of world history is Indian history, unquote. And owing to the region's density, and its connectivity. So, how do you? I mean, how does your narrative challenge the more insular, inward-looking, nationalist histories of the region? India and Pakistan. I mean, they all have their own stories. So that must be a challenge. And how do you address that in looking at this wide, broad brush review of Indian history?
Hmm. So I think it's useful to compare it to modern nationalisms and their views of the past here. And in both kind of current Indian and Pakistani versions of nationalism, those two things share a lot in common, by the way, right? That neither side wants to talk about that, but they really do. And one thing that they share in common is both groups of people promoting those respective points of view. They want to get back at some pure point in the past, when it was
Yes.
just them, when it was just Pakistanis, when it was just Indians in this nationalist republic sense, but well before the republic existed, in there's an emphasis on the purity, right? People want stuff that emerged from the land on which the modern nation of Pakistan sits, or with India, respectively, and that's all a myth, right? Look at a map,
Yeah.
folks, right? These places aren't islands. They were always connected via
Correct.
land trade, sea trade, migrations. I do open the book with a very brief account of how modern Homo sapiens got to the Indian subcontinent,
Mhm,
right? No
mhm,
one is
mhm.
originally from there. They were all ancient migrants. And I think, for a historian, this is, if anything, a somewhat banal point, and it's one that no historian would deny, which is that connectivity is important and is integral to self-conceptualization of communities in specific regions. That's probably a generally true thing, with the exception of some geographically isolated groups, but it is especially true in the case of South Asia, I feel.
Right, right. And these connections and these migrations, which of course are a reality and of course challenge and annoy a lot of people who want to claim who is Indian, somebody's native and somebody's an outsider. And that debate continues not just in India, globally as we speak. Uh, but what struck you during your research? Of course, I mean you're a scholar of South Asia, but for this particular book, what really struck you these connections with the outside world, and how people were moving into India, moving maybe out, and over the centuries, I mean over the millennia, what were the striking sort of features of your research that way?
Oh, sure, sure. So a whole lot of stuff comes to mind. One is that India was the place to be in
Mm,
pre-modernity. Sometimes people, non-historians, like normal people, they word this in almost a negative way, right? They'll say,
mm,
why did India get invaded? so much? Like why do people keep invading us? And I mean, I think that question should really be reworded, right? Like, why did people keep coming? Some
Yeah.
people use violence, others just sort of walked across a river, or not walked, but say sailed across a river, walked right in. And that's because India was wealthy in pre-modernity. It had spices, it had fertile land, it had good agriculture, and it had an abundance of human labor. Those are the things that made for a good economy in the pre-industrial world. Indians did not only stay home, however, right? Outmigration was less common, but many Indians traveled abroad for trade, right? And those sorts of purposes. And along with that, there were Indian cultural exports in pre-modernity. And that was another very striking thing that I try to highlight. Many
Right.
people want to talk about Sanskrit, and I do talk about Sanskrit plenty in the book. I am a Sanskritist. So of course I talk about it. But one thing that I really relished writing was the bit on the Panchatantra stories, these animal fables, right? I mean, those things, that was an Indian bestseller in pre-modernity. Like, people could not get enough of that stuff. We have traces of it that appear all the way in Wales, okay, which is really quite far. I think you add up all of these things, and it's that what you're left with is that the Indian subcontinent had a lot to offer, right? And that there was sort of constant movement in and out. And yet the delightful bits are in the details, right? What did that actually look like? How does that help us explain the shape of modern South Asia today, as well as the shape of cultures across the world?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great response, and has made me think as well. Now, about this periodization and framing, with 5 millennia to cover, it must have been a challenge to decide on how these periods are divided. The early cities, medieval empires, colonial, post-colonial. Were there any frames that you had to discard? Because one of the critiques of Indian history, what I remember reading, time and again, is that how the outsiders had divided, especially the colonial writers had divided these periods of history. So obviously, that must have been a challenge, and you do make a note of that in your book as well. So explain that a little bit, uh, about your framing and about the way you saw these different phases or periods of Indian history.
Sure. So I think I'll say a couple of things here. One is that in the meat of the book, in the actual chapters, I present the framing, but I do not actually present what it is replacing. Right? So I do not actually give you the bad ideas about South Asian history. So your tripartite division into Hindu, Muslim, and then British history. I mentioned that in the historiographical essay at the end, but I don't mention it in the chapters, right?
Right.
Because people remember the bad stuff more than the good stuff. And it's just not worth it, right? So I sort of, I try to enact the change I want to see. I was very clear about the framings I didn't want. Obviously, the tripartite division is out. No historians defended that in decades. I think more eye-popping for some readers is going to be that I discard the categorization by political dynasty, right? So that's the most common way over the last half century, maybe more, of writing South Asian history overviews. You talk about the Indus Valley, you talk about the Vedic period, and then you go into dynasties, the Gupta period, the Chola period, the Mughal period, so on and so forth. And while I discuss all three of those dynasties, I do not label by period. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One is that political history is one kind of history, and only one. Okay, and I did not write a political history of India. That's fine. If folks want that, those exist. But mine also covers religious history and social history, economic history, cultural history. That is all equally important to the politics. And then also political histories tend to be very North India centric. Despite my own research focusing on Northern India, by and large, I did not wish to write a history of India and focus, too much on the North. I instead then opt for a somewhat looser framing. I use terms like ancient, pre-modern, early modern, colonial, contemporary, things like that. I do rely on actual dates a lot, even date ranges where we can't date things and phenomena exactly. I do recognize in the book that I think this approach will unmoor some readers. People are real used to the Gupta period is this, and the Chalukyas ruled at this time, and so on and so forth. My response to that is, if you find something a bit unsettling and a lot of things new in my book, then I've done my job.
Yeah, great. Of course, you have another rather fine job. Now, let's get into some of these different periods or overlapping phases. So like the Indus Valley Civilization, it fascinates everyone. I mean, I'm from Pakistan, and I think we are inheritors of the Indus Valley Civilization. All the Mohenjo-daro and Harappa and other sites. But there are no deciphered scripts yet. They're still under study, but we do know about the urban sophistication. So, what does your book suggest? How should we imagine the people of the Indus, not just as archaeologist subjects, but as part of a living South Asian continuum? And so can you dwell a little bit on that?
Sure. So, as you acknowledge, we do have limited evidence from the Indus civilization because we can't read anything that they wrote, and we don't have long text anyways, right? So for those who are holding out hope, by the way, that we're going to decipher the Indus civilization script, one, we are almost certainly not going to. We don't have enough written in it. And two, even if we do, it's not actually going to tell us that much, right? Like, we don't have the long text that they had from ancient Egypt, all right? It's not going to revolutionize the field in any case. So what do we do with that? You ask the questions you can, and you work with the evidence you have. And I'm very clear in that chapter about, I think I've termed them Indus civilization unknowns, right? We don't know what their political structure was, right? We call it a civilization because they shared certain things in common, weights, the writing system, things like that. But were they one polity? Was it even one polity throughout? Like, it's about 700 years at its height. That's a pretty long period to have one government. So maybe they went through a bunch. Maybe they were city-states, like in Italy or something. I mean, who knows? So we don't know that. We don't know anything about their religion. Okay, we're probably not going to figure that one out, folks. So what I do is I leave stuff like that aside. I refuse to substitute in modern imaginations where we lack historical evidence. History is a positivist discipline. You work with the evidence you have. Now, that leaves us with relatively little that we can clearly say goes from the Indus civilization to later periods. One example that I give is fashion regarding the jewelry that women wore and sort of how they etched white designs into carnelian beads that they would wear around their neck. That is something that we see in the Indus civilization and then reappears elsewhere on the subcontinent way, way later. Arguably, there's some kinds of technology, including how they use a specialized bronze saw to carve shell bangles. All right, so there's things like that, and I contend that these things matter. Right? Who doesn't think about fashion and what you put on your body, how you adorn yourself? Right? I mean, this is stuff that matters to most of us on some level. Of course, the biggest thing that continues from the Indus civilization to later are the people, right? The civilization ends, the people don't. There's no evidence whatsoever of some sort of cataclysmic event, right? It probably just sort of kind of like slowly died out. And so the people went back to a different way of life. For those who had been in the cities, that was probably a pretty big shift to go back to a pre-urban mode of existence. But definitely the people and their genetic legacy lived on.
Right. And but Professor Truschke, you must have noticed, and I'm sure you are far more familiar than I am, that there's this whole idea of proving that the Vedic or Hindu roots, about the Vedic or Hindu roots of the Indus culture. So, do you think that is it more a reflection of the political anxieties of today rather than historical evidence, or do we have enough evidence on that?
That is 100% a modern political issue, right? The evidence is overwhelming that the Indus civilization and Vedic culture are separate and distinct. A few hundred years separates the two. They spoke different languages, okay? And we can know that without knowing what the Indus civilization people spoke. And I know that's mind-blowing, but I do explain it in the book. And they lived entirely different ways of life. I mean, the Indus civilization people built the largest cities of the ancient world. Their cities were more populated than contemporary cities in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Whereas the Vedic peoples, they didn't even live in the same place year round. They didn't even make bricks. right? Like that's part of why we can't link archaeological evidence with Vedic societies, is they left behind such a faint footprint. They possibly left behind basically no archaeological evidence. So these
Mhm.
were two completely separate groups. Now, that doesn't mean that there's nothing from the Indus civilization that sort of carried over and maybe influenced Vedic culture in some ways, but figuring out exactly what, that's the problem, right? And I would just remind folks that the Indus civilization, it was not the only civilizational complex around. You also have the Bactria marginalia civilizational complex. You have people, living in central and southern India doing different stuff as well. So I know people really want to see these connections, but by and large, they are not there.
Yeah, so that leads us into the Vedic world, somewhere around 1500 BC to 400 BC, the early period and the later period. And, so that particular, I mean, it's not a moment. I mean, maybe in history it reads and sounds like a moment, but, there's centuries involved there. So how do you situate this world with the rise of new religious philosophies like Buddhism and Jainism? And what do they tell us about the intellectual diversity and the debates on ethics and power that have often that do inform the present? But tell us about this Vedic world. What was it like, and what are the highlights of that particular era?
Hmm. So Vedic society was highly unusual in both for their period and just frankly in general in world history. Like the Vedic peoples were very different. They cared about texts, but they didn't have writing, right? There was this
Mhm.
huge emphasis on orality. The biggest thing in their world was ritual. That is what mattered above all, was doing certain kinds of rituals. If you were the right person at the right life stage, you have the right priest, so on and so forth. Um, Many people consider Vedic culture to be the earliest sort of incarnation of Hinduism, and that's fine. I often teach it that way, right? But I also will point out to everyone listening that if you were to take a modern Hindu from 2025 from anywhere in the world and transport them back to Vedic culture, 1200 BCE, they would be totally lost. They would not recognize anything. The gods are different. The rituals are different. There are no temples. Some of your big gods like Shiva and Ganesha are centuries away from being imagined yet. So Vedic culture is pretty different and pretty unique. And it had kind of limited buy-in. That's the other thing. I mean, the Vedic tradition has obviously been extremely long-lived, but it didn't take off immediately. Not that many people bought into it. Then we have
Mhm.
India's second urbanization. People start to build cities again. But from their perspective, it's the first time. The Indus civilization is ancient history by this point. It's over 1,000 years ago. So 600 to 500 BCE, people build cities. And in my reading, and I'm following many scholars in this, that's really the most critical context for considering the rise of Buddhism, Jainism, and the Ajivakas, who, if you've never heard of it, that's because they died out about 700 years ago. But they were originally with the Buddhists and Jains in being an ascetic tradition that encouraged people to give up on worldly pleasures in order to seek a higher truth.
Correct.
If you're wondering why that was linked to the rise of cities, well, if you're living in a sort of rural setting, like farming the land, subsistence farming, there's not that much to give up, right?
Right.
And if you do, you probably die, right? So you need cities and that concentration of wealth to give you something tangible to renounce. It is a matter of scholarly debate whether Buddhist, Jains, and Ajivakas, to what extent they were or were not actually rejecting Vedic Hinduism.
Hmm.
Right? Some people say they were. Certainly, they were doing different things, right? Among other things, Buddhist, Jains, and Ajivakas all marketed their religious ideas as for everyone. Okay, the Vedic peoples did not, right? You had to sort of be born into the tradition more. But then other people, and I think I sort of lean this way in the book, will say, look, Vedic traditions just weren't that big of a deal. Like this was done by a subset of people in North India, like no one really cared that much, right? So then we go back to the urban explanation.
Right, right. But and that, of course, later, these major changes are also reflected in the sort of the age of Buddha. From somewhere starts from 563 BC onwards, and then this key and very important figure, Ashoka, Emperor Ashoka, whom you also write about, and in particular. his stature as this enduring global figure, from rock edicts to modern emblems of India. So, how do you interpret his reign? A Buddhist empire of peace, or a pragmatic project, or was it reform after war and violence, as we in popular narratives think? And what does it tell us? Because for non-Indian viewers, his whole focus on environmentalism or political ethics would be very fascinating in the world of today. So please tell us about Ashoka a little bit.
For sure. So first, a footnote. You said 563 for the Gautama Buddha. I do use the newer dates in the book, so 5th
Okay.
century, not 6th
Yeah,
century.
sorry.
Anyways, no worries. So I mean, Ashoka, 3rd century BCE, one of the great men of Indian history, and I put great men in scare quotes. To me, there are no heroes. There are no true heroes, and there are no true villains in history. So did he found a Buddhist empire of peace? No. Right. So on the contrary, Ashoka, by his own admission in his own inscriptions, oversaw one of the greatest slaughters in pre-modern India ever, when he killed tens of thousands of people at Kalinga in eastern India and enslaved a bunch of people there as well. He committed to peace after that. Okay, right. It's always a good move as an emperor to commit to peace after you do your conquest. But Ashoka's commitment to peace came with serious caveats. Right. Again, by his own admission, and Ashoka left these robust inscriptions in stone. This is the beginning of the epigraphy record in pre-modern India. So one thing he tells us is that, look, I'm not going to conquer anybody else. I'm not going to use violence except for the tribal peoples. Right. So they're an exception. And he basically says, like, it's my way or the highway, guys. Right. Like, you conform to me or I will come down on you like a sack of bricks. Right. And I'm using contemporary expressions for a reason, because it helps bring it alive. Sometimes when we read stuff written, over 2,000 years ago, and it's in a different, obviously we're translating it from a different language, in this case from a Prakrit language. And they use different expressions. Somehow the violence can be lost on modern people, and that is a mistake. Ashoka certainly had some intentions. I think it's very much a modern overlay and interpretation to think of them as environmentalism. He also did a fair amount of forest clearing. He was one of the early forest clearers in pre-modern India. But certainly he had some intentions in that environmentalism regard. He wasn't vegetarian, but he tried to eat a little bit less meat sometimes, things like that. To what extent his ideas had impact, however, on his populace, that is much less clear, right? So we distinguish between intellectual history, which matters, and the history of his ideas, but versus, say, a social history of impact, for which I would say evidence is lacking.
Yes, that's very interesting and actually fascinating. And then the Gupta period that follows or overlaps, has also been mythologized as the golden age, quote unquote. And how do you handle that this framing? And do you find it historically relevant, or is it a politically loaded view of that particular era? Because remember that this was also known for the achievements, in the linguistic sphere. I mean, you're a Sanskrit scholar, so Kalidasa, and even the was it mathematics, astronomy, art, architecture, Ajanta, Sarnath. So all of this has been defined, or at least modern India looks at the past like that. A lot of references are made to the Gupta period. So tell us a bit about that.
So I think the first thing I would say is not all of that actually has a lot to do with the Guptas, right? I mean, the Guptas are one of the great overblown kingdoms of South Asian history. I don't even think they qualify as an empire. They were a fairly modest landlocked kingdom that was exclusively in a part of northern India, right? So they didn't rule anywhere close to the majority of the Indian subcontinent. Most people in India who were alive when the Guptas were ruling probably had never heard of them. Right. So, they were there, but they're like one show in town. Yes, people wrote stuff in Sanskrit. People love to talk about Kalidasa and his beautiful poetry, and some of it is very beautiful. People want to talk a little bit less about Manu, and his extreme sort of views against lower caste people and women, right? I think I forget the exact title of that chapter, but I believe inequality is in
Yeah,
the title.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
obviously I'm not into the golden age concept. I think one thing I do try to point out there is that it probably looks different depending on where you were within society. So Kalidasa probably had a pretty nice life. He certainly wrote a lot of beautiful stuff. I don't know how the man paid the bills, but like, I don't know, it was probably pretty fine for him. If you were a woman, same period, same area of northern India, sort of middle of the first millennium CE, yeah, I think life was not looking so good, right?
Mm.
Women's rights, to the extent that we can think of rights even as a concept. I mean, the freedoms of women and their ability to choose their life path was arguably restricting. Patriarchy was arguably increasing. One point I make in that chapter, and it is a basic one, but it can be useful to remind people of this, is that the accumulation of wealth often comes at the expense of the many. Right. So the idea that a particular era in history might produce great literature and nice mathematics and things like this, and that might also be accompanied by a lot of people having increasing human suffering, that actually kind of makes sense.
Yes, I do apologize, Professor Truschke. You can see that a lot of my knowledge of ancient India is so mediatized and coming from all the popular things that, so I'm so glad that you're debunking some of my long held myths as well as I speak to you about your book.
That's why I
But
wrote the book.
yeah, that's why you wrote the book, of course. So that leads us to the coming of Islam, 7th century onwards, and the encounter with the and today's perhaps most contested idea in contemporary India, where history is being invoked to sort of for various political projects. But uh, you know, coming to that particular period, I mean, the early encounters, the traders coming to India, and then the Delhi Sultanate, and later the Mughal Empire. So how and that's a big, long sort of era. Many eras overlap there. How did India change, and how did that encounter work? Was it as linear as these invaders coming in and occupying India and being these barbarians, as some of the modern day political narratives suggest, or was it far more complex and nuanced, as perhaps your book also underlines some of those encounters and engagements? So tell us about that a bit.
Sure. So Muslims first come to the Indian subcontinent via land and sea, north and
Mm.
south,
Yeah,
respectively. Around 700, mid to late 7th century
yeah.
CE. And for the next 500 years, very little changes for most South Asians, right? So there is a sort of footnote exception up in Sindh, where we do have Arab-led rule, okay, but that doesn't expand outside of Sindh, so that's a regional issue. For everybody else, there's some Muslims around doing some stuff, working as traders. Some of them work for various quote Hindu dynasties, right? We do have that, where you have Muslim administrators of various sorts. But otherwise they just sort of integrate into Indian society. I think it helps to keep in mind that India was very religiously diverse, right? I mean, when Muslims show up, there's Hindus of a variety of kinds, okay? And Hindus don't call themselves Hindus. They say, I'm a Brahmin, I'm a Kshatriya, I'm a worshiper of Shiva. So from the perspective on the ground, that was arguably a bunch of different traditions at that point. We have Christians, Jews show up around the 10th century CE, Zoroastrians a bit later. We have Buddhists, Jains, Ajivikas are still hanging around, a bunch of nature worshipers of various sorts. So there's like a lot of different people. So a Muslim guy getting off a boat, people have been getting off boats for, well over 1,000 years by this point, looking for spices and various things and saying, yeah, by the way, I worship a God called Allah. I was probably like, okay, like, can I tell you about the price of pepper, right? So initially not that much changes. Things start to change a bit more rapidly right around 1200 CE. And that is when we have Muslim-led rule from Delhi, right? So if you ever wondered, by the way, why the national capital of India's republic is Delhi, That's thanks to Muslim rulers. Okay, Delhi was nothing before this, really. It was a very small town. In any case, so once you have Muslim-led rule, that puts Muslims, specifically in northern India, in a much more visible position and with more power and resources to spread their cultural views. Notably, Indo-Muslim rulers don't really spread their religion, right? There is no Indo-Muslim kingdom that ever runs a conversion program, ever. And I know that Hindu nationalists say that they do all the time, the Mughals, so on and so forth, but they are making this up. Okay, the Indo-Muslim rulers were rulers first, kings first. In any case, things accelerate throughout time. I think one thing I'll say is I think the concept, two things with the barbarian and the invader concepts. So I sometimes tell my students, if you want to know whether you like a pre-modern Indian king, I'll just stop you at pre-modern. You hate the guy. I guarantee you hate the guy, right? Like there is no concept of human rights. There's no concept of individual liberties, right? Like this is a pre-modern world where one individual exercises power over others, often by very violent, visceral nature. So, if the question is, did the Mughals enact vicious punishments at times? Of course they did. So did the Cholas. Right? The Cholas were referred to as blood-sucking ogres by another Hindu-led dynasty in text of the period, right? People really hated the Cholas. They could be very, very vicious in their raids, including against other Hindu temples, by the way. Now, the invader thing. So the concept of people invading, you have to have something to invade, and it's worth specifying what they're invading. India doesn't exist in pre-modernity as a political entity. It's just a geographical sort of convenience, the subcontinent. And so, when the Mughals come in from Central Asia, and they do come from further north, right? So they originate outside of South Asia. But when they come in, they overthrow the last Delhi Sultanate kingdom. They overthrow another Muslim-led kingdom, right? They don't invade India. They invade the Lodi kingdom.
Yeah.
And so I think that's worth specifying and thinking about. I think that kings of other religious backgrounds, Hindu kings, Buddhist kings, the occasional Jain king, they did the same thing, right? Yeah. Go from one part of India, you go to another, right? Many, especially the Mughals, did intermarry. So by a couple generations in, they're pretty intermixed, right?
Yes.
In terms of barbarian, I think your mileage varies on that, but I think people would be surprised, and I hope they are, at some of the tidbits that they find in the book. It's maybe not what you think.
It may not. Yeah, exactly. And then obviously, this is a very contested area, and I'm glad that, because ultimately facts, as you said, evidence, historical evidence, is important when it comes to understanding our past. But then, this the so-called Muslim period, or 1857, with the War of Independence or Mutiny, and India becomes formally part of the British Empire. Earlier, the East India Company has made huge headway, and this, I guess, today's moment is kind of, a lot of people, at least I see it as an extension of the colonial, British colonial era. Considering how some of the administrative structures, of course, Mughals headed up, but the administration, the bureaucracy, the military in Pakistan, the English language, etc. So how deeply did India change or transform in that, in this British colonial period?
I think I would generally concur, right? Obviously, a lot of the colonial apparatus has been retained by modern South Asian nations, right? The Indian Constitution, much of that is taken from British sources, not entirely, right? The British didn't write the Constitution. Indians wrote their own Constitution, which was a remarkable achievement. Many immediately post-colonial nations did not manage to do that, including Pakistan originally. But they still kept the vast majority of that apparatus in place. So, how much did India change during the colonial period? I think a whole lot, right? Every once in a while, somebody will ask me, what would South Asia look like without British colonialism? And I'm like, I have no idea. Like, I can't imagine that. That's too dramatic of a set of shifts. Among other things, that signals our own proximity, right? Yeah. Colonial rule was not that long ago. And so that's the impacts of colonial rule, I think, are going to look a lot different 500 years from now. than they do to us right now, right? Colonialism is almost just barely still within living memory.
Right, right. And this leads me to two last questions. One is, of course, histories, histories as they are written by emperors and kings and conquerors. So, you make an effort, and you mentioned that you try and weave in history, voices of the marginalized people, or those classes that do not have that sort of social or political power. How challenging was that, Audrey? Because obviously it's not an easy feat, looking at the antiquity, or the even in medieval period, it's difficult. So, what about the sources? I mean, what key sources informed your writing?
Hmm. So I don't know how to answer that succinctly. So I'll just tell you more anecdotal stuff. And I
Yeah,
can't answer it
maybe a few
succinctly
examples.
because there's so many sources, right? Because I
Mm,
cover such a broad period in different
mm,
regions. Um, but in terms of trying to get in diverse voices, so I employ a couple of sort of tools of the trade, right? One is I read against the grain. So I take a source like Manu's Dharma Shastra, which is a very well-known Sanskrit text written by an upper caste Brahmin man, but I read it through the eyes of a lower caste person, right? And what his harsh words about, how lower caste people should, accept their lower position in life and be treated as, third class citizens, what that looks like from their point of view, Manu's embrace of inequality. So that's one thing. I also do try to seek out sources from more unusual places. So, for example, I think she's in the 12th century. I talk about a woman named Ashu, who is a slave. She's bought by a Jewish trader, and then she's freed, and they have a couple of kids. And then, sorry, they marry after she's freed, and then they have a couple of kids, and one of them dies. And, so I talk about sort of what that might have been like and a little bit about her life. And I do that using documents from the Geniza archive, right? Which was a trash heap in 12th century Cairo. So a bunch of stuff gets thrown in there. Most of it has nothing to do with India, but this one guy's letters, who had spent time in India, who married Ashu, get in there, right? So I do that. And then the last is I do look for sort of any representations of less discussed people. Obviously, it's better if it's written by the person in question. But, for example, when you go looking for Dalit perspectives in pre-modern India, you come up empty-handed. There's nothing. I've never found a text written by a Dalit in pre-modernity. But I did find a 17th century Telugu play that is about a Dalit. Now, it was written by an upper caste person, an upper caste man. So there are obviously severe limitations to his portrayal of this Dalit woman. But still, it's better than nothing, right? You work with the evidence you have, you include all the caveats so that readers are aware of what they're accessing. But I will say that just because it's difficult and just because our perspective isn't perfect, right? It's like looking through cloudy water, doesn't mean you shouldn't try to see what's on the other side.
right, right. That's fascinating, really. And finally, let's come to the present moment. I mean, your books and your sort of very clear cut, as a historian position to focus just on facts and evidence obviously gets a lot of reviews and reactions, and sometimes they're really horrible. And I do, kind of empathize with that. But so, how has this book been received thus far? I mean, in India itself.
Mm. So far, the reception has been great. I think you referenced this earlier. I have been very gratified by the reviews. I
Yeah.
feel like many reviewers have picked up on many different aspects of my project. Obviously, people have had some critical things to say, and that's great, right? If you, by the way, have written a critical review of my book, trust me, I'm reading this stuff. I'm keeping notes, right? Maybe I'll do a second edition someday. Who knows, right? So I do appreciate both the praise and the criticism. I will say, just on being a historian who is generally targeted, and people get upset that I'm so attached to facts, and often this is expressed most often against me in terms of sort of emotions versus facts, right? People say, you're hurting my feelings, you're hurting my sentiments, right? I don't like what you have to say. And my reaction is sort of like, tough luck, right? um, I would point out if it helps anyone to like hate me a little bit less, all right, or at least just don't actually send me hate mail, like just write that and I don't know, keep it to yourself. Um, I don't follow ideas about the past because I like them. If I were writing the story of Indian history as a novel, I would write it so much differently. But that's not what this is, right? I go where the evidence leads. I have made a lot of arguments over the years in print, including in this new book, that I probably would rather not have made. But that's not a question you ask, right? You don't ask, do I like history? Is this how I wanted it to go? You just go where the facts lead.
Yes, thank you. That was a great conclusion. Facts and evidence, and ultimately they matter. Thank you so much for being with us, Audrey. And I hope your book is read and it is well, it is available, and I'm sure that people can read and also learn something new about their past, not just in the subcontinent, but I guess globally, because it is equally important for non-Indian readers.
Thank you so
So
much for having me.